First, let's talk about this fabric. This is its blueprint. This proves that the fabric is not intended for cutting. This piece is very small, and this edge with needle holes refers to this part. This edge has 2 rows of needle holes. This is the fabric's raw edge, and when cutting, the yarn is parallel to this edge. This is what I took pictures of earlier. This is the thread. The yarn runs parallel to this edge. Then there are 2 pieces of cloth. This piece has the non-woven interfacing attached properly. The other piece is to ensure there's enough. If you want to stick it yourself, you would also stick it this way. Make sure this cloth is properly aligned. Then place the non-woven interfacing on its reverse side and adhere them together. Ensure the non-woven fabric is facing up. This prevents the glue from sticking to the iron. And when you stick it, don't spray water. If you spray water, it won't adhere. And this is its brim. After you finish drawing this side, flip it over and draw this part. Draw both of these sections. When preparing the material, start by taking a wide shot. The hat falls into the category of larger colored pieces, and it goes up to here, and this is its skirt. Just shoot according to the position above. Then this is the hem and the flying edge of the skirt. The smallest one is placed at the back. You can just find any place to stuff this in. But its fabric must be parallel to it. This side is arranged. You can look at its fabric to find a big pattern. Then when you get to this side, it gets farther away. It aligns it vertically and folds it over. This way, you can also see if the fabric is parallel to it. Just arrange a little and shift it a bit. The gauze looks appealing when displayed. This outfit is visually appealing. And this colorful piece features double stitching. They all have a seam allowance of 0.5 because some of my friends prefer closer stitching. So I created a close-fitting set. The close stitches are also marked on top. There are also several variations. There are also a few different types of fabric. This is wide gauze. This type of colored film is a colored mesh. When cutting the mesh fabric, just follow this. Cut along the fish mark above. This allows you to cut out a straight line. Determine the approximate width and cut a straight strip. Then fold it in half and compare it to this. Then cut it again. You can create the fish's cutting angles. This is the folding symbol. Do not cut this part. This piece will definitely be short. It is folded in half and then cut. And this is a sock. The sock is made of knitted fabric. And this one. This one is also made of fusible interfacing. The contrasting colored fabric at the front, right at the front center, just like that. Just don't cut it on top of this. Cutting it is useless. This cut is of white jacquard fabric. This is it does not need to be cut. It's a plastic template. This goes inside the brim. That's a hardboard. Supports the brim to lift and expand. This is the finished product I have cut. So there's no need to cut. This might be for later. If you need to cut it yourself, this is still useful. And this is its part, the waist of the slip skirt with a waist exterior and interior. And then the mirror plate. This is the mirror plate. It looks a bit strange. Leave an extra 1.5 centimeters at the bottom edge. To make that mark, draw a straight line. I cut out a piece. Take a look. This is how it's used. Align the bottom edge. Then I marked a seam allowance. Then after aligning it, then I saw that this entire circle is very symmetrical. Then draw it out. This way, the mirror line is properly drawn. Then after we have drawn the top part, there is still one line missing at the top. Simply cut this off. Align it with the bottom part. Also draw the mirror line at the bottom. This way, the seam allowances around it can be more even. They are all in straight lines, right? Then draw this line below. It has been drawn as well. This way, the seams around the piece can be more balanced. All are 0.5 centimeter. This is how to use the mirror board. This bottom edge must not be cut. Cut it all off. This part has also been removed. This is the visor of the hat, you on top. Once the upper mirror line is drawn like this, also make sure to draw this side. Then cut off this edge. Draw this one at the bottom. This is a 0.5 seam allowance. Then align the upper mirror line. Draw the final line. Each visor is used this way. After both symmetrical pieces are completed, next, cut off the seam allowance. This is all the panel pieces, the mirror piece of the face panel. Then, regarding the markings on this pattern, because if you want it to be symmetrical, you need to mark the center, each panel piece. They all have markings on them. Mark the places that have annotations. This is the mark at the front center because it will be needed at that time. Align this while sewing, it's this point, to be connected with its counterpart. Sew them together. Make sure both sides are of equal length, so this edge needs attention. This marked point must be marked. There are sleeves. This is the middle point of the sleeve. It is used for seam alignment. This point indicates that it's the front sleeve fabric. We need to connect the front sleeve fabric, and this point is the seam while making it. This point needs to be marked well. The sleeves made this way will be good, they are easy to work with, then the effect is somewhat better. After all these mirrors are drawn, then we can cut them. First, make the hat. Just cut off the hat. First, let's make this dress. It's all drawn now. Then we can cut it down. After cutting it down, some areas may come apart. If it comes apart, just use a clamp. Clamp the head part for a while, let it bond more thoroughly. Then it won't come apart. This can sometimes come apart. If it comes apart, it's fine. If there is no hard board, then just sew it like this, because its purpose is to ensure that the fabric doesn't twist or deform when cutting. Now that the trimming is complete, it no longer matters. Then what's left is this glue can also prevent it from fraying. If the glue comes off, then you shouldn't pull on this edge. Be as careful as possible while doing it. Don't let it fray. Start crafting. Let me first talk about a hand sewing method. The sewing machine is used for sewing. Can be used. In some areas, you can use a sewing machine. In some places, hand sewing can also be used. For instance, this embroidery hoop and this small patch. Hand sewing may be easier in this case. I will introduce a method. I will teach a hand sewing method. The first stitch is a back stitch. Back stitch. It's just like starting a stitch with a sewing machine. Both need a back stitch. Then the second stitch looks like this. I use larger stitches when I sew. You still can't see it clearly. But when the child makes it on their own, they make very small stitches, like this. This is the second stitch. Then turn to the reverse side, like this. When this stitch is sewn over, it should go beyond it, like this. Then the next stitch still starts from here. Sewing machine. Just sew these. Take a look at the reverse side. The reverse side looks like this. There can't be any empty spaces. Then this is the front, then flip it over. This type is quite sturdy. Mine just has a larger stitch spacing. Then, when we make the doll ourselves, the stitch spacing should be very small. First, create the upper body, the front part. So these are the two sides. This side piece is stitched together with the front side. Then this is the fabric for the front transitional color. It is combined with the lining. First we do. It is combined with this lining. The two are stitched together. After stitching like this, turn it over, turn it to the front side. When it's on the front side, this part at the front should be a little higher. The interior cannot go up to the top. Let it lean down a bit, like this. It means not to let the inside show. Then it has a positioning point. Both of them have a positioning point. It must be drawn according to the reference sample. These 2 points are for aligning here. Ensure both of them are long, align. Otherwise, once the sewing is completed, if you keep switching back and forth, it will twist. To ensure they are both sewn together equal length, then sew this. This was sewn by me earlier. It is completed like this. This requires inspection. You are at its most curved point. Mark 3 inspection points. Mark to the midpoint of the seam allowance. Don't mark at this line base here. This way it's easy to miss. Then when you sew, align this cut corner with this cut corner. This makes it easy to do. Look at the seam along this edge. This inspection mark needs to be addressed. While working on it, make adjustments as you go. Use your hand to match this curvature, then sew it together. This way you can adjust it as you work. This way the corners will align. Then begin from here. Make a back stitch. I only have this one piece. Hand sew it and take a photo. Sew it a little more finely. The ones behind are all the same. Unfold this as you sew. The stitch distance should be slightly smaller. If this mesh opens up, it's fine. As you work, ensure their lengths match. They must be of the same length. Then when you reach the last stitch, you should also backstitch. Make sure it doesn't come undone. You can also add a couple more stitches. Then after you finish the stitches, tie another knot. After sewing, this is what it looks like when turned over. Then handle them again. These 2 front pieces are stitched together with the front center. Keep this in mind. Align with those marked points. Then, as they are being stitched, should these 2 be stitched first? When sewing, this corner cut is aligned well. Don't sew to the end. Just sew until you leave, about 0.7 centimeters away from it. Sew to the end. Sew to the end. Don't sew to the end. Just sew until you leave. About 0.6 to 0.7 centimeters away from it. Just leave a small piece. Don't connect them all. The method of this previous version is a bit special because of this kind of style. If you want to make a full lining, there is only this method. It's a bit troublesome at the front, but once you learn it, it's quite easy to do. Once it's pieced together like this, neither of these two has connected to this position. Just leave a small piece. Then the inside is the same as this. The inside connects with this side, like this. Looking from the front, the face connects well like this. The inside also connects well like this. Then, flip it like this. Looks good like this. This point is aligned with the one at the front, the top edge. Then this part comes from above. Continue sewing until you reach the halfway point. Do not sew all the way to the back, just sew up to here, because this is meant to be kept for the connection inside. The purpose of doing this is to make it come to life. This is only sewn to the halfway point. So from top to bottom, this is a living thing. Then look at this side. Flip it over. Just insert this front middle into this front side. Then this side. Smooth it out again. It still looks like this. Then from top to bottom, also at the halfway mark. This is also completed. This can be functional, it can be opened. Then this part of the blade, it is as follows. It should be lifted back, open it like this. Then you can press two visible lines. Then you can heat it slightly with your hand. You don't have to press it. This is a properly pressed one. It's like this. It's a pressed one. It's like this. This piece of yours won't be pressed. If you want to do it, you just press a line of 0.1 on each side. I want to see what the effect is without pressing. Actually, normally when making a clothes, this seam just needs to be pressed. That's it. Then when you're doing it, when attaching the sleeves, you need to pay attention here. This seam needs to be opened up. This should be flipped over first. Then take care of the back, the front and neckline of the back piece. The neckline area needs stitching. You can also use a hand needle. You can also use fabric adhesive. Just use the two together. The back piece, front and collar. After the P-point is well defined, adjust its collar, the area with a large curve. The entire back collar should be tapered. Don't cut to the line, leave a small gap. So when it is flipped over, it will flow very smoothly. Otherwise, it won't turn easily. Without a pointed edge, it can't be flipped over. Once this is flipped over, together with the previous ones, the back stitching and linked with the front ones. Collar aligned to collar, sleeve opening aligned to sleeve opening, this way, then open them up. Sew along this line. Insert the thread to sew. Its shape is like this. Do not sew in a straight line. If you sew a straight line, the diagonal line on the shoulder, the effect will be lost. After making it, it will become a flat cut. It's not very good. So it's this shape. Then at this shoulder line, it is recommended to use a hand needle because if you use sewing glue, it's difficult to make turns. It will go straight through. It becomes a straight line. When hand sewing this, you need to pull tight, but don't pull too tight, just right. Otherwise, when it is turned over, it will be loose. As soon as you pull this apart, you can see the white line. Tighten it a bit like this. Then sew it into the seam. This is necessary to separate it. Like this, otherwise it will be very thick. The bend is too small, so the position of the seam must be handled well. Most of them are separated. This way the wiring is sealed, then flip it over. This seam must be aligned, and then like this, you need to pull this pointed seam apart. Then fold it over. This way it won't be so stiff, it's also very smooth. Another method is the same as this one. This way, the pointed seams at the front and back. The front and back pieces are joined. Then make the sleeves. This sleeve has a center point. This point corresponds to the front armhole. Don't turn the sleeve inside out. First, carefully create small folds for this sleeve, then stitch it together. Just follow this guideline, but do not go beyond this line. Sew 2 lines of basting stitches, wait until you reach the 0.25 mark, then sew another line in the center. Once this seam is completed, go back to its center. Sew another line in the center of the seam. 1 line of tissue paper doesn't have much effect, that's why 2 lines are needed. It looks like the sleeves will puff up. It has that kind of shape. This way, both lines are completed. Then begin to gather the pleats. Focus all the pleats on the sleeves. It's exactly in the armhole. The position halfway up the sleeves. At the spot just below the large curve, there is no pleat at all. It's flat. You must put the pleats on the sleeve, then complete the pleating. It has a shape like this, just like the shoulder that fits on the body. It curves around smoothly like this. It's a bit three-dimensional. The other sleeve is made the same way as this one. Finish the sleeves and set them aside. After both are done, we can start stitching them together. Then make sure to check the front and back. This is for the marking points. This marking is for the front. It connects to the front sleeve. This way, first align the shoulder seam in the middle with the key points on the sleeve. Sew a stitch to secure it. Now align it precisely. Then you can start by sewing a stitch with a hand needle. Then adjust the length of the armhole in relation to the sleeve of the shirt. In relation to the armhole, the length of the sleeve, it should be the same size as this armhole. Just pull this thread. Be careful that there are no pleats in this curved area. Cut from here. Just go down from this seam. It's all useless. Then adjust the length of the armhole. It's the same as the sleeve shirt. It's the same as the armhole. The length of the sleeve. It's the same size as this armhole. It's useless here at the seam joint. Then sew it. This is also after adjusting the length. Then you can sew it with a hand needle. There is a stitching seam. Here is the stitching seam. You need to unpick the seam and separate each side. Then stitch this sleeve. This sleeve has been stitched. It is hand stitched. And what about the other end? This is the same as that. Its quality is right here. Then when it's completed, this seam should face outward. Tilt it towards this side. Then when it's sewn on, it shifts slightly like this. If the seam is facing inward, it will cave in. Sew from the center to the sides. Sew another stitch in the middle. Start from the middle. Then sew towards this side. If this embroidery hoop is too bent, you won't be able to manage it. Just make it pointed. The pleat length of this size must be placed on top. Do not place it here below. Where there are curves, there isn't that pleat dimension. Open this seam. Then sew again. Just sew all the way to the end. The same goes for the other side. When you return, sew down from the middle. After this sleeve is done, I'll put it aside for now. Make the cuff. It's the trim on the sleeve. Then first attach the lace, sewing with a 0.5 stitch. Sew it together like this. Like this. After it is sewn, turn it over, then press a 0.1 millimeter line. Cuff. Tie the lace neatly at the top and bottom. Then press 2 gathering lines at the top. Gather the pleats. Gather it to match the sleeves. It should connect right at the cuffs. Tie one end of it, then adjust the length. Tie and secure this end, then adjust the other end. It's just a little bit off, almost there. Get them to the same length, then tie a knot at this end too. Tie a bowline knot. If there's a difference at the end, then just add a lot to it. Then open it up. Adjust it again. The knot is tied. You can go and make this pleat uniform. It must be uniform. Then adjust it until it's just right. Then stitch it together. You can also check this side. This makes it easier to sew. Then sew it together. Sew it this way and then flip it over. Then press another rice noodle. Press it down this way. Another method, it's completely the same as this. It's also a pleat. This is how this sleeve. Once the edge of this sleeve is properly finished, sew the side seams together. You can simply use a hand needle. When you reach this point, the seam at the armpit, it needs to be separated into left and right. Then sew it like this. The side seam is done. Then handle this armhole, sew it to look like this. When you get to this point, be sure to have an angle. Just follow this seam to sew. Then press this. Press this to create the pointed opening. Handle the inside of the armhole. The line should enter at a distance of 0.1 centimeters. If you don't create a pointed end, you can't fold it back. Then press down on the entry line like this. Fold it back by 0.5 centimeters. Then press down a strip of rice noodle, a rice noodle that is 0.1 centimeters thick. After rolling the edge of the armhole, sew the side seams together. Once everything is sewn together like this, you can turn it over now. When you're flipping this over, it's also a side seam. This seam edge is completely bit. You need to separate it from left to right, then flip it back over, then flip it over again to prevent a lot of fabric from piling up under the armpit. Then, after flipping it over, take another look. Don't mess it up. This part is separated. The upper body is basically like this. Then start making it. Let's set this aside for now. We are making the skirt hem. This is called a skirt hem. Below is the lace that attaches to this, here. Below is this strip, and the front is short. Short in the front, long in the back. It's easy to see. This is how short it is. Then it slopes down. First, sew on the lace. Make sure to attach the lace properly. Then gather the fragments. Then connect this pattern on top. It matches that sleeve. It's the same as that sleeve, using a similar method. Typically, you would first attach the lace to it and then roll it up. Then flip it over. This way, sew it together with a 0.5 seam allowance. Then, flip it over. Press like this again, pressing the marking line 0.1 from the front. This is how to press it well. Use the same method for the other one. Then press 2 crease lines on top. You can hold it steady with your hand. 0.5, then press another line in between the two 0.5 marks. After pressing, create the creases. Poke it to match the length of the joint part above. Tie a knot at one end to secure it, then adjust the pleat size. Be careful when poking the pleat. Avoid pulling out the threads, as they can easily come undone. Once you start poking the pleat, it becomes less sturdy on top. Pull it to the same length, then tie a knot at this end to secure it. Once it's secured, adjust the pleat amount. It should be adjusted evenly. You can do it slowly. The pleat amount isn't very large. Just follow the pattern size and don't add any pleats. If it's too large, the bottom edge will curl up and look quite unappealing. It's intentionally made this minimal. After adjusting it evenly like this, stitch it together. Arrange it like this, 0.5, 0.2. After stitching it together like this, flip it over and press a 0.1 rice noodle in the same way. It has been pressed this way. After pressing this rice noodle, roll the edges back by 0.5 centimeters at the front center. Then press a rice noodle, a 0.1 rice noodle. Roll it back to 0.5 like this, then add this lace trim. The front side of this lace is the shiny side and the textured side is the back. Above this joint seam is the small flower and below is the chain. Seal it like this. This is how it's done. The methods on both sides are the same because they are symmetrical. After it's done, press 2 lines on top. This is where the waist is joined. Then pull it tight. Press both sides with double lines and pull it tight. It's the same method as when joining the previous hem. Tie a knot here. Then adjust the length. It is tied here, connecting the white and blue parts. Adjust to the same length, then tie a knot here too. A slip knot should be tied here, as the quality may be too short or too long, allowing for adjustments. You can tie a dead knot here. Let's look at it like this and join them together. Then compare it like this. Check the difference. When it's almost there, go connect it. You can start the stitch here. Initially, it's best to use a hand needle to piece it together. If you use a sewing machine, it may not line up correctly. It needs to be aligned perfectly here. You can observe it. Pay attention to this part while sewing. Start sewing from here, so align with this part. Sew it like this. If you do it this way, it will definitely be off at the end, so sew it diagonally starting from here. Make sure this side is aligned, pinch it for me. First stitch, make 2 back stitches to secure it. The first stitch should be reversed for 2 stitches to secure it. Then the side seam here also needs to be opened. This way, the middle seam can be adjusted. Both of these seams can be turned back, but this seam needs to be split apart. This is separated into left and right. Make the stitches a bit tighter, pull them a bit tighter. You can look at it while you walk. It looks like this. You can make a basting stitch like this, and then go around with the sewing machine. Make the stitches a bit tighter, pull them a bit tighter. You can do a temporary stitch like this, and then go around with the sewing machine. You can do a temporary stitch like this, and then go around with the sewing machine. Then keep an eye on this while sewing. The back needs to be aligned. By the way, the fold here for the back should be smaller because the hidden button needs to be installed at the back later. If you fold it this way, there won't be a place to put the hidden button. The stitched part looks like this. You need to pay attention to this part at the beginning. It is tied like this at an angle, not like this. Okay, let's turn it over and check the effect. This way it aligns perfectly when flipped over. Then let's work on the other side. Do the other side in the same manner, and it's the same when stitching this side. After taking out the good paper, align it with this. No, don't align it this way. It should be at an angle like this. And then the 0 point here. From this side to that side is exactly 0.5. Then align it with that. Sew it like this. After both pieces are properly joined, then proceed to do the front part. This pointed section at the front, just fold it back along the seam by 0.5 centimeters. First, fold one side, then press a line like this, 0.1 centimeters. Make sure to fold along the grain line, 0.5 centimeters. Just fold this side back to form a 0.1 millimeter rice noodle. Then this side is the same. Still fold it back to 0.5 and check it out. These two sides must be symmetrical. After folding, ensure this angle is at the center. Then this side is also the same. Press the rice noodles down to 0.1. It's okay. Could you see that clearly just now? Press a little more, fold it back to 0.5, and press the line this way. I didn't capture it just now. Like this, it has been folded well. Look at the result. Then sew it a little, then give it to someone, another person. Sew the 0.1 millimeters rice noodles to secure them. This is done. Then the next step. Is to prepare the inside, the lining of the skirt. Connect this lining with the one above in the same manner. And this is its part. The lining of the skirt. This mesh fabric cut must match this. If you cut too much fabric, if you buy this too long, the result may not be very good. It makes the waist look thick. Because it is attached to this, then if it's too thick, just modify this waist. It opens up. It affects the overall effect. So just follow this length. Do not change it. Then before proceeding, completed it before starting. First attach this lace. This lace is used for, it is wide and pressed on top of the base. This aligns with it. This bottom label is aligned. Press it down like this. Then the spacing above this has been adjusted. Are there a few adjustments to make? 1, 2, 3, 4. The spacing is 5 units. Like this. Like this. Go backwards. This is only meant for small pieces of fabric. Follow this method to do it. Then, when sewing the lace, follow this guideline. This is the point for the fish design. This point is measured along the distance. Just sew along the points. Then up here, create 4 folds with a double line. Because it's this mesh fabric, it has elasticity, so it will move. So your first line is placed at this point. Then the second line is placed on slightly larger between the two, maybe around 0.7. If it's 0.5, all the colors will run out, making it difficult to handle. I left this seam relatively wide. Basically, it's based on thing. This dot needs to be worked on. Then press down on both lines. It's the same as making 4 folds. This sewing machine is easy to operate. It just suddenly gets jammed. You can also sew by hand. It's not too long. It's the same method as the previous folding technique. Then tie a knot at one end. Adjust the length from the other end. Then with this cloth, tie them together. That's right, you need to take a close look. First, place it face up to see. Is this lace on the front side? Then turn it over. With this bow, decide how to handle it again, then flip it over. Sew it this way. Like this. Then adjust the length. Adjust the pleats evenly. After they are the same length, tie a knot. Then adjust the pleat again. This is how to tie it well. Turn it over and take a look. The lace should be facing the front. Make sure not to reverse it. Then trim the loose threads. Within this skirt hem, once it's cut properly, the next step is to do this. Sew this to the edge using a hand needle. Just like this. Begin from the back, sew all the way to the front panel. While sewing this, you just need to pay attention to this. This is a single side, then it has a fabric. When sewn to this point, it is also a single layer. And above this point, you can't go back to sewing that single layer. It needs to be double layered. Sew all the way to here. Then it is double layered. At this point, it becomes single layered because it can't be sewn shut here. Ultimately, it needs to be stitched like this. So it needs to be stitched on this surface. Do not attach the fabric to it. Then the other side is the same. This hand stitching just needs to be neat. After the 2 lace edges are finished by hand, then flip it over. Take this one, center back, sew it together at the back center. It's been stuck. When sewing the lace, do not let it get caught. Sew the lining and the outer fabric together. You won't be able to flip it over then. This lace is tucked in between. Sew them all together. Once this back seam is finished, then it can be flipped over. This one here, this right-angled part needs a bit of folding, otherwise it won't be able to be turned over. If it's turned over, there will also be something there. It's just like there are a lot of things inside. When it is folded this way, it's a square corner, then press it over like this, then draw a clear line, around 0.1. This. This center back seam and this other seam should not be put together. They are just staggered, one long and one short. It looks a bit overly slim. This way, the center back seam stands out. Fix the interior of it. Don't let it escape. Then the next step is to attach. Nail the button and the front ornament. Then check the button's position. The button is just sewn on the edge. Then before sewing this piece, just align it with that. Use a pen to mark the center point. It's difficult to get misaligned this way. If it gets misaligned, it will show up. This situation of twisting. Then, a total of 4 were fixed. One is on the waist and another one. One measurement below the hip circumference. It's approximately 1 measurement below the hip circumference. Then pin another one below. This one has become a bit twisted after pinning. Only then will it reveal a little. Just go down. Then on the decoration at the front. This fox's mouth can be glued. Use that glue stick to attach it. You can also sew it by hand. Place it in the upper section, then leave a space for the beaded chain. The beaded chain is stitched on. This is hand-stitched. One end of it is sewn on this side of it, and then this other one is sewn onto this on this edge of the lace. This one, the tearing. Then the pentagram is also hand-sewn. By the way, this lace is also embroidered. It is sewn on later. So what's next? Like this. Place the seam here inside, a hidden place inside. Then once it's sewn like this, then connect their wiring. You can just sew them together. First, secure this section. Then this section. Align 2 pieces of the same height. This, no need to leave it too long. I will cut this properly. The finished product after cutting. Then provide an additional chain. Cut out 2 perfectly finished items. Then provide 1 more piece to avoid that, or if you want to make 1 more, or maybe this suddenly isn't sufficient. First, turn this back to secure the needle onto this garment. Then wear this, the chain that is closest to the bead. Just sew it onto this piece. The first stitch is on the edge of this lace. The second one is for this bead curtain. The height is the same as the first one. You can sew these 2 first, then sew the other 2. After sewing, turn it inside out. Now tie a knot. After sewing 1 stitch, tie a knot. There is 1 left. This is also sewn onto this lace at the first edge. Then it's too lengthy. I won't capture this heart shape here. The heart shape is just alongside it. Sewn on top. Sew it on both sides. It can be just like this one. Next, we have the sleeves. The sleeves are also hand-stitched, like this. Sew a circle, and then connect it like this. Cut off the excess. That's it. I won't film this either. Add a button at the back. I just mentioned it. This sleeve still needs to be photographed. Starting from here, sewing should start from this side, sew from back to front, then press it down at the back. Because when I was sewing this just now, I sewed it from the front to the back, then stack it up on this side. You can slightly see it. There is this mark, there is a seam mark. So this is it. Then from the back, sew from the back to the front. That's fine. This needs a single thread. Using a double thread would make it very obvious. It's quite stiff. Using a thimble would make sewing easier. Then cover a little at the seam here before finishing. Then tie a knot inside. First, pour for a while and then tie a knot. This will make the knot a bit firmer. Then bring this side over and cut off the excess. This is fine. This piece of clothing is fully finished. Only this star and the hidden button are missing. This needs to be hand sewn, then just sew like this. This way the dress is finished. There is also a holy dress. When this skirt is just completed, it puffs up. It's just a little bit unruly. So almost everything is finished this way. It needs to be made smooth. Like gauze, it should be smooth and straight. It needs to be like this. You can't yank it because it is not very strong by itself. It is easy to fray. Don't force it. And especially at the base, it doesn't easily get damaged. Squeeze it a few times and knead it a bit. Then this piece of clothing will look better. It will be more visually appealing. Especially this display. It's just easy. Wasn't it more pleated before? Now it's been made smaller. But after you finish, you still want it to look like this. Just give it a shape. That's fine. Create this skirt support. The top part is made of cotton fabric. This is shoe-patterned fabric for the skirt waist. There are 2 layers in total. There is an additional layer underneath to prevent it from being too sheer, and you can also spray some extra protection. Now we are cutting the waist of the skirt. One is the waistband, and the other is the inner waist. Then this is the mesh, and it should be cut according to the dimensions above. This is the cut piece. Then the wider one is the waistband, and the narrower one is the inner waist. Then cut the mesh fabric based on this fish point. It will be straight, so there's no need to measure with a ruler. Then find its width according to the size on the sample. Then check the location of that point to see where it is and cut according to it. This way, it will be straight. I've cut this one. The inner layer is narrow, while the outer layer is wide. This lace has an outer layer where you can add a layer of lace, depending on your preference. Based on the style requirements of the time. This is the lace for the base, which is attached on top. Just press down the line. So I will create this style with lace, making it a full design. There is a style of petticoat that doesn't need lace, that vintage ant design, because the outer layer of tulle is quite sheer. So now we are focusing on the lace on the outer layer. Only the outer layer has lace. Once the lace is finished, the outer skirt tie needs to be adjusted to be flat. It's like a piece of the face exposed this way. Then inside, the waist is narrow, and the skirt hem is narrow as well. When you pull your hand out, since it's a single layer, the sewing machine can easily get stuck unexpectedly, so you should take it a bit slower, or you can use a hand needle. I sewed this by hand. Sometimes when using a sewing machine, it can get bunched up, so it ended up pulling itself automatically. The result is that it can only create a single line. But with this hand stitching, you can create a double line. You can simply sew 2 lines. Sew one line at this point, and then sew another line in between. Once it's done, you can pull it from here, pull it to the same length as this waistline, and then join them together. You can tie a knot here and a tight knot here. Then adjust from this side. Adjust its length. But the pleat allowance on both sides should be smaller. It's about a distance of 1.5 with no pleats. It's flat. This applies here as well, because when sewing later, there can't be too much fullness in the back center. It's about this long, so tie a slip knot here to secure it. After adjusting the length, adjust the fullness. Fullness, this side has less fullness. The spacing is even. From the back center to here, leave about 1 centimeter, approximately 1.5 centimeters. Then adjust this pleat to make it uniform. After adjusting the pleat amount, you can sew them together. It's also a 0.5 stitching. The pleats on both sides should be eliminated. Do not leave any pleats. This seam is finished, set it aside, and then address the waist. The waist consists of this narrow strip. Then, the twill is on the front side. Then the folds within the pleats are flat. The twill is the right side. This is also like the previous waistband, not the outer skirt hem above. It's the same. After gathering the pleats, it's joined together with this piece. You can also use a hand needle. Find an easily recognizable point that is good for sewing. Use it as a standard. You can just follow this seam. It can remain parallel. This mesh hole is too large. Household sewing machines, this type of plastic one, it can easily get stuck while sewing and suddenly stop. So hand sewing might begin slowly, but it's generally smoother than using a sewing machine. If it's double layered, it won't happen, but it becomes too bulky when double layered. The standard seam allowance is 0.5, but you can make it wider. I have set it to 0.7. It's not done according to that seam, but based on this point. Don't exceed 0.7 and avoid making it too large, otherwise the hem will shorten after sewing. This is the same as the last one. It's the same as that. Cut to the same length, then stitch it together like this. Oh, right, this is what I just finished, and it still needs adjustment. After adjusting, piece it together with it. This adjustment is uniform, and the folds on both sides have not flattened. This sewing machine I just tied off, and I haven't adjusted it yet. After adjusting it, I'll stitch it together. It has not flattened. Then sew like this. After this seam is finished, place it here so it lays flat. Then this one goes like this. Flip it over. It aligns with its seam allowance here. This joining seam here connects with the piece above it, sewed together. Then this is its second layer. When it's sewn, it looks like this. Inside looks like this. Then lift it up. Let's press this with a bright line. Press a 0.1 bright line. It means to fix it in place. Press it on this line. After pressing this layer of bright line, flip it over. The first layer can also have another line pressed. It's fine not to press it. The one I did before didn't have a line pressed. It's okay. After this line is pressed, then to here at the waistband, roll back a seam allowance of 0.5, then press a 0.1 top stitch to secure it. After doing this, sew the center back. This fabric has more, right? There are quite a few layers, so be a bit careful while sewing. You must make sure to align them. Or you can first trace a line on them. Secure them in place and then sew them together. Actually, it can be done in one go. So let's go with a seam allowance of 0.7. If it's too small, it might be overlooked later. If the seam allowance is large, you can trim it a bit smaller. This seam allowance, aren't we going to roll a hole for you to wear shortly? Like this, you need to move the seam allowance aside. Typically, if you feel that this needle can pass through, then you can separate it. This method works too. However, sometimes the needle can get stuck here when passing through this hole. The seam allowance can also be folded this way. It's just a little thick, but it won't be too noticeable. Flip it over like this, then align this edge with the seam. Place it next to it, but don't make it too long. If it's too long, it will affect the movement effect. It can only go this far and cannot go any lower. Then when you're sewing, this is where you start sewing. Then the hole is left at this spot. Do not leave it here. Leave a hole here. Then at the right time, insert here. Just right. This seam fits perfectly. Then during the stitching process, we start from here, then make a loop and stop here. Then it's stitched well. When stitching, start from here, then make a loop and stitch to here. This hole was not left here directly. Stay at its edge, then wait until you wear it. Just use the back of the needle, go in from here. This seam is blocked because it is oriented this way. So it won't block this needle. Sew it like this, and you only need to go around once. Then it will look like this when you wear it. Fold it back and use the thread. Sew it up with this needle and thread. Make sure it goes in smoothly. It's okay to leave the line a bit longer. Then just go around like this. You need to place your hand behind. Come out from this hole. Once the hole is pulled out, please don't cut them yet. Place it on the little cloth's waist. Place it on that doll's waist. See if it has been cut out. Take a look at what size is suitable for you. Then decide how much you want to leave. Then use a hand sewing needle to seal the opening. That's all you need to do. Usually, you can figure it out by hand. That should be about right. It should fit around the hip, you can see for yourself. Then tie a knot here. Make this knot a bit tighter. After tying the knot, this excess part can be cut off. Then there is this remaining opening. Seal it up. Just sew a few stitches with a hand needle. The spacing of this line, wearing this Sony headset, the spacing at this midpoint, it's about 0.7. Perhaps it wasn't explained clearly during sewing. Looking at this line like this, then it's here. Let me measure it. It's about 1.8. It's simply that you can see it. Don't go too fast and don't be too narrow. It should fit into this Sony headset. Just let it move back and forth freely. But the extent to which it retracts, it definitely reaches here. It is just at this seam. If you wear Sony headphones, you wear Sony headphones. If you go beyond it, this area will become tight. The hips will become particularly slim. Then this will look very ugly when fried, so you should not exceed this point. This skirt support is ready. Then let's talk about this sock. The sock is designed based on this line. Fold it back. It's easier to do it this way. Fold back the top edge by 0.5 centimeters. Then this sock can be made using a hand needle. It's also the first stitch. Return to the previous stitch. Then the stitch should be slightly adjusted. The stitches should be a little smaller. Put it aside, then fold it in half. Do not cut it yet, just flip it back. You can cut it too. But you also need to tie a knot. Just follow this thread, you can just sew it on. This sock is very simple. Wrap it around the top a few times to secure it. You can also start by cutting it there, but if you're too lazy to tie a knot, you can just sew it together continuously. Then fold them over and sew down like this. Yes, you need to use that kind of stitching. You shouldn't use a straight stitch like this. Make a back stitch this way. Avoid using a straight stitch. Sewing directly with a straight stitch will cause it to leak. The results will be significantly better. Sew around from top to bottom. The sock is now finished, then turn it inside out. The seam allowance can be trimmed off, make it a bit smaller, cut off half. Don't make it too small, it will easily come off. That's it. This sock is finished. Make the other sock the same way. This one is good. The first thing to do is the hat. Then cut the hat first. Cut it as you go along. After the hat is cut, you need to attach a layer of mesh on top. This mesh is also cut according to the fabric design, but this edge follows the fabric pattern. It is a straight fabric pattern. Then cut according to that piece of the fabric design. Arrange it like this. Do it in this direction. Leave it a little larger. Don't make it too precise. This fabric will provide a sufficient amount. Then cover it up. Leave a bit more to prevent it from happening. Because it is elastic, sometimes the stitching may be insufficient. Just leave about 1.5 units of space, or just 1 centimeter will suffice. And each one is done this way. I will only cut one piece. Let me describe the method. That's it. Each piece is like this. Leave a section out, then press the line on top. The pressed line must be less than 0.5, because in case it gets sewn later, it's easy to miss that stitch. Fix this mesh to this piece. This mesh is actually on this piece. This mesh actually has a front and back side. Choose the side you like as the front. I chose the fuzzier side. This side is indeed the back, the side with the plush facing up. It is the front. Anyway, this mesh isn't very noticeable. Try to pay attention as much as possible. Anyway, it's okay if you put it on the wrong way, because you can't tell. Then you can sew with a sewing machine. You can also sew by hand. Sometimes the sewing machine, it can easily get tangled. You can also sew with a hand needle. If you don't mind it being slow, usually a sewing machine is used for sewing. This piece is sewn with a sewing machine. It tends to make it not very flat. If hand sewn, it may be a bit flatter. The stitches can be a bit larger, but don't exceed this seam. Watch a bit while sewing. You need to keep it flat. And when doing this, do not touch this area of the fabric. Although it is stuck, it is not easy to unravel, but try to avoid touching it as much as possible. Do not tug on it, because the tension is too strong. It can still easily unravel. If this piece is cut out, there are areas where it is detached, then use the deck to secure everything again. It will no longer come apart. Don't press for too long. It can easily burn the glue. It is at its strongest when this glue dot is visible. It's different when it has fully melted versus when it hasn't. When it has fully melted onto this fabric, this means it adheres very well, it won't separate again. Typically, when making collars for adult garments, this type of glue is often used. Bumper, collar and bumper, bumper, collar and bumper. This is sewn. Then while sewing, its bottom edge is aligned. Align this at both ends. This straight point, this point is used as a fulcrum, not as a marker. Then align it here and then sew it. After sewing, this point looks irregular. We'll twist. This looks very right, more visually pleasing. Then start sewing this piece. This is the brim, center of the hat, bottom of the hat. First, stitch these two together. Next, this midpoint must align with its center point. These two should be positioned in the middle. The goal is to align them. To prevent it from getting misaligned during the final sewing. Unequal lengths. One is long, the other is short. This way, you can align it at the center and then at the back. The chance of misalignment, it's the type with inconsistent lengths. The phenomenon will be smaller. Then in the middle, you should align it with its center point. These two should meet in the middle. The purpose is to align. It will be smaller. Then this patch, you need to pull it apart. Sew this way, fit both of these together. Then they separate. Just pull this patch apart, then flip it over. Press a seam line on each side. Then like this, start sewing. After finishing the seam, just flatten it out. And then on top, let's wait a moment before sewing this, before sewing it. First, we need to sew on this lace. If the final product is finished, if we sew it by hand afterward, it will look like this. There are stitching marks here. If you don't want this mark, then before you finish it, sew this lace on. In the middle of this line, like this. Find their center points. Then make a line on each side. Secure it. The needle size can be a bit larger. Then while sewing, keep an eye on it. Focus on its center point. Then the thread is pressed on this. What is this? Then press another line on this side. This way it will be fixed on top. It's a bit pulled. In this situation, if there is a conflict, give it a heat treatment. It's okay without heating. It just needs to curl up. Be vigorous. This is emitting smoke. It's due to being curved. So after stitching, it will surely emit smoke. So this is emitting smoke. It is meant to curl up. Forget. This is smoking. It's because it's a curve. So after it is stitched up, it will definitely curl up. When stitching like this, after it's done, this smoke rises up, curled upwards. Then, after getting this done, just put it right the shredder after shredding to be able to splice with it. Then, on top of that, press down another line with a thicker thread. of 3 millimeters. That needle code will suffice. Then you can put the line that was secured earlier, also cut it off as the line for the shredder. That refers to 2 lines for the shredder. Its effectiveness is often better, and when it is pulled in, it can be secured regarding a line. You just dropped it down. It just returned. Then So the previous midline, it needs to be cut properly. This is during the cutting process. Center line, the center point must be marked. And this is also relevant. It also has 2 center points. This point, align it. First, secure both of them. Use a hand needle. First, sew a stitch. Secure it. If the sewing machine is used properly, it can ensure a smooth splicing process. There are no issues with the splicing. You don't have to make it so complicated. Normally, when talking about shredders, I always do it this way. First, fix it in the middle, then adjust it towards both sides, or make another knot. It's not likely to come loose. And since it's fixed in the middle, then I will adjust its length. It only needs to be adjusted evenly. Don't touch it. Don't make it too long at once. The size of this pleat isn't very large. It's almost done, then just adjust it a little, make it usable. It'll be fine when you sew it. Make sure to align, then the pleats will be uniform. Then sew it together like this. This side is aligned. Align this side as well. Check how much pleating there is on this side, then you'll know on your side. Then make it the same length. Then let's start sewing. The pleats must be even, like this. This curve, you can sew by hand with a needle. If you're using a sewing machine, you need to be careful. Be mindful of your hand strength, like this. Create the curve like this. Like this. It might stick out a bit, so you sew as you go, adjust it a bit. It's in the wrong position. Like this. Then start from here, sew from the middle to both sides. Ouch, no need to take it. Then start from the middle, backstitch, connect the previous broken thread. This video is definitely going to be long because I recorded this sewing process. I just want to create a bit more detailed than other videos. All right. Typically, those that are more difficult, if you need to create pleats, I always use this technique. This part is considered finished for the face. Now we will work on the interior. The method for the interior is the same as that. It simply lacks lace. It's also about combining smoke and heavy components. And then this type of pressure line, and then this type of pressure line. And then the shredder connects with this. Then I won't record this process. It's the same as that. After the inner and outer layers are connected, then place them opposite each other, with the front facing each other, looking at the seams on the back. This needs to be clarified first. You need to open up its seams. Don't worry about the top, but for the bottom, the seams on the top are mostly leaning this way. And then this part at the bottom, to prevent it from being thick. So open it up both inside and outside. After peeling it apart, sew it back together. Pay attention while sewing here. If it feels rough, you will feel uncomfortable. Then leave an opening while sewing, because you need to put that plastic board, stuff it inside. Then don't consider this for now. Then from here, it's the middle part, from the halfway position, only left enough to fit that plastic board. So just start sewing from the middle. Sew to the middle over here. By the way, when sewing, place this front with lace. It's best to put it underneath, because when sewing, what about the section below? It may be a bit bigger. Because if the front is a bit larger, you'll find out once it's completed. Then sew it onto the hat's center of the brim. It also has a central point. Sew a lining with its central point. It's sewn well, sewed all around from here. Align the center point this way, then sew it to this side. Leave a large gap here, so you can insert the plastic board. Insert the plastic board. That's correct. Turn it over, and then you can adjust it. After you turn it over, because this is the front side, place it underneath to sew, so the front will be somewhat larger. This way it has both an interior and exterior. That's it. It won't regurgitate this, so normally it should be below. Then you can simply insert it. The opening is quite large, then be careful not to unravel it. Be sure to flatten it after inserting it if you feel it looks a bit tilted. Take out this suppressor board. Trim this edge a little bit. I will try to get it just right, but some people may sew it. It might not be the same size. If it's just a little off, it will be uneven and twisted. If it's too large, it needs to be flipped up. Then take it out and trim it a bit. This way it can be flattened. And then the inside of this part needs to be a bit smaller. Move this part back. Roll it back. Then this way its cap will be flat. In the end, this side will be a bit larger because of the amount inside. If it is the same as the outside, it has thickness. If it's the same, a lot will be piled up here. It needs to be flattened. Flatten it. Just make sure it fits perfectly with its head. Don't let it pile up in one spot. It looks really bad. Flatten it after you are satisfied with it. Then create a line here. Fix it in place. It still needs to be hand stitched. Let's hand sew. To prevent this plastic sheet from moving, if you prefer not to, while hand stitching, if you want to avoid seeing the thread marks, then stitch along this seam. Sew up to this seam or apply pressure on. Sew along this line. This way it won't be very noticeable. Then while sewing, don't use your hands. Just keep an eye on it a bit. The main goal is to make it flat here. I'll still take a shot of hand sewing here. Actually, this video is filmed in more detail. If this is done smoothly, then if we make another style, we probably don't need to watch the video. I already know how to do it. I'll just sew along this line. This way, I think it will be sturdier. I won't take this process too slowly. Sew from here to the very end. Then sew while keeping an eye on it. You must keep this. Just keep an eye on it and don't twist. It is flat. This circle is fixed well. After it's done, ensure that it is smooth. Then try to put as much from the inside as possible. Spit it in, spit it out. The inside is what goes in, like this. And now it's time to seal it. Use a hand needle for sealing. Then sew. The top is folded back by 0.5 centimeters. The bottom may need a larger fold, because if you also fold the bottom by 0.5, the amount inside will be significant. Do it this way. Remove the excess amount. Then fold it back a bit more. Then connect it to this. Fold it back, it's approximately 1 centimeter. The top is folded at 0.5. Fold this amount on top along this line. If it gets smaller, the entire hat will also be smaller. The interior is not an issue, it's to ensure it remains flat. Then feel it with your hand. Are they completely stuck together? This works perfectly. It fits snugly. The inner surfaces are bonded together. If it's too small, it won't work inside. When you put it on your head, the hat will be small. After flattening it, stitch it with a hand needle. It's also possible to sew it with a sewing machine. However, some sewing machines are plastic and meant for home use. If the plastic sewing machine is too thick, it may not pass through. Using a hand needle will allow it to stitch through. Lace will be added here later, so it's okay if this trap leaks. Here it's held with the hand. This seam won't be discussed. Open it up while sewing. You can do this before sewing, just press it down with the sewing machine. There's no need. Now, when hand sewing, you can ignore it. You don't need to search for this. After sewing, make 2 knots. Make it a bit tighter. After sewing, tie 2 knots. Make it a bit tighter. After sewing, check it. This bell and the fabric must fit together. Be sure not to make it too small. Then trim the thread cap. Make sure the main part of this cap is done well. Next is to add that lace. This is how the lace looks. It is placed on the outside. Clamp these two pieces in the middle, then sew this lace to the seam when piecing it together. When you reach the brim here, this way it's completely done. On the inside of the brim, just stick to this edge seam. It's not exposed on the outside. This is the brim. This part is made of a hard plastic board, so you can wear a thimble to prevent finger pricks. Make a turn at the seam here. Don't forget, because if it's visible, I've tested the effect. It doesn't look great. So sew it inside. Sew it closely to this edge, sew all the way around. Then this edge seam. That's it. Just like that. 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 After this seam reaches the end, this lace, they need to be connected. The two are combined. It's also fine to sew them together. It's a bit long, just trim it a little. Leave a little bit for the overlap. Then sew the two of them together again. Make sure the stitches are as invisible as possible. Then sew a few circles of lace here. Or you can use that glue stick. You can also use a little glue. Using too much can make it hard. Secure this joint. This lace is all done. The lace at the bottom looks good, and there's also the lace on top. This layer of lace on the outside, it's meant to cover this thread. We will also start from here. Then you can use that pen to make a mark. Hand sewing is also an option. You can also use glue. You can also apply this water-based glue, then sew along this line. You can also use glue. It's also fine if you don't draw this line. As long as they are thickly parallel, it's fine. The width of the edges is the same. This is how the outer lace looks. It sticks to the edge at the back. Then at the front, it is glued along this seam. This has a front and back. Take a look while working on it. There is a curve at this joint when gluing. You should stick it along this edge. Then cut it here, cut off the excess length, assemble it together. This lace is now attached. If you're using a hand needle, you can go slower. Moreover, this board is quite thick. And this bow is made from eyelash lace. It's a handmade bow. I think neither size works. The width is approximately 4.5 centimeters. About 4.5 wide will be sufficient, or you can create it to your desired size. My sample garment is that size, 4.5 to 5 centimeters. Then fold it into the shape you want. Cut it out, sew it with a hand needle. Then just tie a knot. Pin it in this position. First, sew the bow, then sew on this little flower on top. After sewing the bow, do not cut this thread. Also sew on this little flower, then cover it. Cover the marks that protected the bow earlier. It's so thick. Be careful not to break the needle. This needle is quite brittle. I can never find that type. A needle that is slightly more flexible, I always end up getting those very stiff needles, and they snap with just a little pressure. This one is fine. Then attach the small beads. Then sew another stitch. It's really thick here. The whole of the bead should be oriented sideways. The surface is smooth. Then sew the second piece. There are a total of 5 little flowers. This is the final step. This is the order of the arrangement. This part, this part, this part. The part of the little flower has been sewn well. There is also one that is attached. This is glued on. It is glued to the edge of this bow. Then cover it up. This lace also has a reverse side. Put the shiny side facing out. It's trimmed nicely. Then apply some glue here. The heat is insufficient. It has grown a little. Luckily, it can cover it. Don't make the length too long. Okay, this hat is finished.